In this tutorial, I will be explaining the following basic Hibernate concepts. I will explain the concept of Hibernate dialects. I will explain how to perform the basic CRUD operations. Also, I will explain 3 of the 5 core APIs. We have 5 core fundamental APIs of Hibernate. Right now, I will explain 3 of them. We have the Java application. From there, we interact with the database. The only way to interact with any database is to send SQL queries. We already know that Hibernate can generate these SQL queries. We already know that Hibernate is a framework which can generate these SQL queries. Hibernate make use of dialects. Dialects are nothing but Java classes which generate these SQL queries. For different databases, we have different dialects. For DB2, we have DB2 dialect. For Postgres, we have Postgres SQL dialect. Right now, I'm using MySQL database. For that, I'll be using MySQL dialect. We have database version specific dialects also. Like for Oracle 10G, we have 10G dialect. For Oracle 11G, we have 11G dialect. Whenever you change your database, you can just change the dialect names so that SQL can be generated for that particular database. Whenever you change your database, you can change the dialect classes so that SQL will be generated for that particular database. Next, we'll see about the basic CRUD methods. CRUD stands for create, read, update and delete. In a database, we can do only 4 operations. One is to insert data, which I call it as create operation. Second is to read the data. Third is to update the data. And then we can delete the data. As we know, in Hibernate, we do not generally write queries. Instead, we write methods. We make use of Hibernate methods like save, update, delete, and get and load. This for inserting data, this for updating data, this for deleting data, and this for reading data. Whenever you use these particular methods, Hibernate will be generating SQL underneath. Hibernate generate SQL because SQL is the only way to interact with any database. I'll be using these methods in further examples. Next, I speak about the 5 core APIs. The 5 core APIs are used everywhere in a Hibernate application. The name of the APIs are configuration, session factory, session, transaction, query, and also criteria. Right now, I will not explain about transaction. I will not explain about query. I will not explain about criteria. About that, we'll be learning in the further tutorials. Right now, I'll explain only about 3 APIs, the 3 core APIs. One is configuration, another is session factory, another is session. I'll be explaining about configuration, session factory, and session. As I told, first I'll be exploring the 3 basic APIs. One is the configuration, second is the session factory, third is the session. Before I explain about the configuration, the session factory and session, first of all, I'll try to understand the session factory code, what we have used before. This is the my session factory class, the code which is written by myself. This code is supposed to create a session object. Here we make use of configuration, session factory and session. Before explaining what is configuration, what is session factory and what is session, first I'll try to understand this code. Before I explain the configuration object and session factory and session, first I'll try to understand this code. This is the code written by myself. This is the user-defined code which makes use of three Hibernate APIs: the configuration, the session factory, and session. In this code, we have three parts. In part 1, we create a configuration object. In part 2, we create a session factory object. In part 3, we obtain a session object. In part 1, we create a configuration object. In part 2, we got a session factory object from the configuration object. In part 3, we got a session object from session factory. Configuration is a class. We can create an object of the configuration class. Configuration object has a method called as build session factory. Configuration object has a method called as build session factory. Configuration.build session factory, we can get session factory object. Now from configuration object, we have obtained session factory object. Session factory has a method called as open session, which will return session object. Now from session factory, we have obtained session object. Configuration is a class. From the configuration class, we can get session factory object. Session factory is an interface. We can get an object of type session factory. From the session factory, we can get session object. Also, you can see that configuration object is loading the configuration parameters from the Hibernate configuration file. Configuration object is the first object we meet. The configuration object is used to configure and bootstrap Hibernate. It is a simple object. It is responsible to configure and bootstrap Hibernate. This is the first object we meet, and we meet it only for once. It is used only at system startup to configure and bootstrap Hibernate. It is only used to configure and bootstrap Hibernate. It may read the configuration parameters from the configuration file or through some other approach like the programmatic approach. Now we know that configuration object is used to configure and bootstrap Hibernate. Next we'll learn about the session factory object. Session factory is responsible to create session objects. Just like the car factory create car objects, the ball factory creates ball objects. The session factory will create session objects, and session object is the most important object of Hibernate. Just like the ball factory creates ball objects, the car factory creates car objects, the session factory will create session objects. And session object is the most important object of Hibernate. It is through session you can do all the CRUD operations: inserting, reading, updating, deleting. Generally, there will be only one session factory in an application. There will be only one session factory corresponding to a particular database. For a particular database, there will be only one session factory. The session factory will read the configuration information for the particular database and create session objects. If you use more than one database, then you will have more than one factory. The first factory create objects corresponding to the particular database. Second factory create object corresponding to the particular database. As I told, you will only have one factory corresponding to a particular database. In an application, generally there will be only one factory. If you have more than one database, then you will have more than one factory. Now as you see, we have only one factory object, and many clients will try to approach the factory for getting session objects. Many clients will approach the factory for getting session objects. When many people try to interact with the same resource at the same time, they may spoil the resource. For that reason, session factory must be created in thread safe way. session factory is not thread safe. You must create it in thread safe way. Next, I'll speak about the most important object of Hibernate. That is the Hibernate session object. Session object is the most important object of Hibernate. It is through session you can do all the CRUD operations. As we know, session is created by session factory. There will be only one session factory, but there will be many session objects. There will be only one session factory, but there will be many session objects. Every client will use a separate session. You can create as many session objects as you want, but you should never share the session. You can create as many session objects as you want, but you should never share the session among clients. Every client should operate with separate session. Session is nothing but a connection to the database. Session represents a connection to the database. Just session is like a pipe or a connection. In JDBC, we have the concept of connection. Here we call it as session. Session is not just a connection, it is more than that. Session is a collection of objects. Session carries data, session carries objects. Session is a pipe which carries objects. Say when I try to use employee object, employee 1, employee 2, employee 3, these objects will be passing through the session. Also salary object, etc. So session is a collection of loaded objects. Session is a collection of loaded objects. Session carry a lot of objects. You call it as session is a collection of loaded objects. Session object is not thread safe. And it need not be thread safe. Session object is not thread safe and it need not be thread safe because session is never shared. You are never going to share a session. Every client will use his own session. Means every client will operate with a separate connection. Session is nothing but a connection, as we know. Every client operate with his own session or a connection. In this tutorial, I explained the concept of dialects. Dialects are responsible to generate SQL. They are the Hibernate classes which will generate SQL. I have shown the CRUD APIs. A Hibernate developer should start with the basic Hibernate APIs like save, update, delete, get and load. I have shown 3 of the 5 core APIs. I explained the concept of configuration. Configuration is used to configure Hibernate by reading the configuration parameters. It is to configure and bootstrap. Second is the session factory. Session factory will create session objects. And third is the session object, which represents a connection to the database. Configuration object will configure and bootstrap Hibernate. Session factory will create session object. Session object represents a connection to the database. And session is a collection of loaded objects. You can create as many sessions as you want, but you should never share the session.